All right, everybody, we are online, so let me say good evening to you, and hope you've had a blessed day. Looks like it's been a beautiful day outside. Good to have you with us tonight, and before I forget it, before we go any further, I do want to remind everybody, tomorrow's National Day of Prayer, so if you don't get to be a part of a prayer group somewhere assembling, pause around noontime, because most of those groups gather and pray around noon. And wherever you are, pause and pray and just be with them in spirit. And if you're not able to do it at that time, sometime during the day tomorrow, just be sure and lift up a prayer for our nation, which I'm certain that you do anyway on a regular basis. But it's about that collective praying together as we pray for our nation. And I've got something here. Pete told me as I came in, he said, I've got something for you on your desk. So I was looking over this. It's, you know, it's kind of like the Art Link letter. Kids say the silliest things, you know. And I thought I'd read a couple of these. I really like this first one right here. It says, the beginning of a proverb, whether it's a biblical proverb or it's just kind of a traditional proverb. But I really like this one. Listen to this. The very first one says, better to be safe than punch a fifth grader. I don't know. I know a few fifth graders when I was a kid needed to be punched. Then listen to this. I'm going to give you a couple of these right here. This is pretty good. So this on this side deals with how do you decide who to marry? Now, listen to this. Okay, listen to this right here. You got to find somebody who likes the same stuff. Like, if you like sports, she should like it that you like sports. And she should keep the chips and dip coming. Now that's a smart man right there.
He's unmarried.
Yeah, he's got a lot to learn. He's got a lot to learn, doesn't he? Now listen to this one. This comes from the female perspective, okay? This comes from a little girl named Kristen, age 10. No person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it all the way before, and you get to find out later who you're stuck with. Oh, so yeah, that's interesting. So thank you, Pete. I always appreciate stuff like that. So, all right, if you would take your Bibles and open them with us to 1 Samuel chapter 22, and we're going to make our way through this chapter this evening. You know, last week we were in chapter number 21. Kind of the theme of that was David fleeing. Remember, we saw him fleeing to Nob, and he goes there and has the encounter with Ahimelech the priest and gets the showbread to feed on, and then, of course, the sword of Goliath. And then, of course, after that, he goes on and he flees to Gath because he goes to the Philistines, to the Philistine city of Gath, and basically ends up a prisoner of the Philistines while he's there. And I shared with you last week that we get more insight on that from Psalms 54 or 56 and Psalm 34. Psalm 56 is about his time during his imprisonment there, so to speak, while he was captive of the Philistines. And then Psalm 34 is his psalm of celebration of finally being released. So just as we learned something about David as a captive at Gath from the Psalms, we're going to learn some things this evening. So if you look in chapter 22, we're going to continue that theme of fleeing here at the beginning. Because after David leaves Gath, verse 1 of chapter 22 talks about how David flees to his refuge. And so it says, David therefore departed from there, that is from Gath, and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, the term Adullam means refuge. And so what this was a cave that became David's refuge. Because you got to remember something, all right? We talked about this after everything developed with Jonathan realizing that his father Saul is really out to get David, and he shoots the arrow, that means, you need to go on, brother, and just go move on and So basically that begins a period of time of when David is kind of like a wanderer, a fugitive, almost like a vagabond, just traveling, He doesn't really have a place at that point to call home. Because he can't go to his house, he can't go back to the palace, he can't go to Samuel. Going to Samuel would endanger Samuel and so forth. He can't go to the house of the Lord, the tabernacle, and we're going to see how that shakes out, because he did in chapter 21, and we're going to see how that works out here. He can't even go to the ungodly Philistines. I mean, they even imprisoned him, So he can't go anywhere. So basically, he goes to this cave, Adullam, which means refuge. And so there he found refuge in this cave. By the way, he's not the only person in the scriptures to find refuge in a cave, right? A man of God? Who else can you think of? Who does that bring to mind? Who else went and found rest in a cave? Elijah. After he runs from Jezebel, goes up to the mountains, into a cave, so forth. And but there he finds a place to rest, a place where he can have refuge, some peace and quiet, some safety for a period of time, and so forth. But it's interesting how David, in writing his Psalms, that he has written about these experiences. So in Psalm 56 and 34, he wrote about his experience in Gath. In Psalm 57 and Psalm 142, he writes about his experience in the cave Adullam, here in his refuge. They both read very similarly. And so I'm just going to read Psalm 142. It's a shorter of the two Psalms, but you get an idea about the things that were going on with David during that period of time. And you may want to look at Psalm 142 or just listen as I read, but here's what he says. So here's what he's writing while he's there in the cave in one of these Psalms. I cry out to the Lord with my voice. This is Psalm 142. I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord I make supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. Well, what would have been the trouble that he's pouring out at that point? What's the issue at hand? What's going on? Yeah, I mean, he's being hunted like an animal, basically. It's what it comes down to. Someone is seeking his life, and he's done nothing worthy of death. Verse 3, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me. Now, you remember last week we talked about the question, was David in the flesh or was he in the spirit, so to speak? In chapter last week, especially like when he goes to Gath and some of the stuff that he does. And more than likely, the conclusion is he wasn't really in a good walk with the Lord at that point. He's pretty much relying on David. I think that has run its course for the most part, okay? And so he comes here and he says in verse number 3, when my spirit was overwhelmed with me, then you knew my path. Now, isn't it interesting that he's coming back to the reality? God sees what's going on. God knows, okay? God's eyes on him. Verse 3 goes on and says, you knew my path in the way which I walk. They have secretly set a snare for me. So what he's saying is, Lord, you know this. And so the implication of that is that he knows God's watching out for him. Verse 4, look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. Well, that may be a bit of hyperbole. There were some people who cared about him, right? But let's be honest. You know how we human beings are. We get on our pity parties, right? Nobody knows the sorrow I've seen. All that kind of stuff. And so we speak in some hyperbole, like nobody cares. That's not the case, all right? Verse 5. I cried out to you. Now here's the whole thing about fleeing to the refuge. The cave Adullam means refuge, but here he finds he comes back to his true refuge, all right? Verse 5. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, what does he say? You are my refuge. So you can see that David's had somewhat of an awakening, an eye-opening, okay? You are my portion in the land of the living. What do you think that means? You are my portion in the land of the living. Do what? Yeah, but what does it mean? You are my portion here on earth. What does that mean? Do what?
Basically, all I need is giving himself over to God.
Yeah, essentially, you are my purpose. You are my purpose. You are, as the old song said, my reason for living. I think that was Eddie Arnold. That was my mom's favorite singer, all right? Or something like that, all right? But you get the idea. You are the reason I live, okay? Verse 6, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Let me ask you a question. Is that a confession of weakness or is that a confession of wisdom? Because here, think about it. Who are we dealing with here? This is David, who the people sang his praises. Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his what? 10,000s. But here he's having a moment where he's realizing that even as great a warrior as he is, a bit more than what he's up to.
The people are fickle. You have to remember, they sang Jesus' praises 5 days before.
Oh, that's true. There's no question about that. Yeah, there's no question about that. But for David, it's an eye opener. It's a moment of wisdom. It makes me think about what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, okay? Where Paul has the thorn in the flesh. 3 times he says, I sought God to remove this thorn, but God says, no, I'm not going to remove this thorn. But what did he say? He says, what I will give you is my grace. For my grace is sufficient, for in weakness my power is made strong. Is made great. In other words, God's power is manifested in us when we are really at our least in and of ourselves. And so David's coming to a realization. Verse 7, bring my soul out of prison. What prison would he need his soul to be brought out of? Think about where he was. Think about where he's been. What kind of state of mind do you think that he might have been in? Depression, a dark place, right? What happens when people get into dark places with their thinking? They don't think clearly. And they don't think in terms of truth and so forth. And there we tend to make mountains out of molehills. So he's needing God to bring about a change of thinking, perspective in his mind, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. So that gives you a feel for what was going on there in that cave. And you can also read Psalm 57 about that a bit later. So here's the thing. God brought David to that place, the physical place, the cave of Adullam, so that he could minister to him and deal with him to bring him to the place spiritually where he needed to be. But basically what David was doing, he was having to turn away from some backsliding and overconfidence in his own self. And so here's the reminder for you and me. Many people oftentimes think, if I can just get my circumstances straightened out, I can get better. But that's not usually the way it works, is it? The reality is, we can actually get to a better place emotionally, mentally, spiritually, even while our circumstances are not so great, and that's a lot better likelihood of our circumstances turning around. If we stay in a dark place, it's not likely that the circumstances are going to change, right? And so we need to remember that's a very important practical application for you and me. So here he is, he's in this cave, and then we go on in verse number 1, it continues, and it says, so when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. So his family rallies to him there in the cave. They got word that that's where he was. All right. Now, so they rally around David. And there's another reason why they're there. They're there also because there's a threat against them, as we're going to see in just a moment. Okay? And here's an interesting note. His family's rallying around him. They're going there to him, but they're also going to be with David to help bring protection, to find protection for themselves, because there's a threat on them. Interesting note. When David was younger, remember how he was oftentimes discounted? And now look, he's the guy who's the protector of the family. He was the one that was least regarded, and now he's the one that they're looking to for help. Verse 2, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. And you got to factor in probably some of them had wives and children and so forth with them, all right? But let me ask you a question. What do you think it says, all right, about the context in which they were living? Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Does that say that things were going well for the nation? Saul's madness was creating chaos in a lot of places. And so you've got a lot of disenfranchised people that are turning to David. And the interesting thing is this. David did not go out and recruit these people. Who brought these people to David? God did. He brought these people to come and gather around him. And what could have become a mob, God brought them to David, and David became the leader of this group to actually turn them into what we would call a team or a useful, fit group of people. Verse number 3. Then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. And so he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Now let me ask you a question. Why in the world is David now going to the Moabites? Why would he go to the Moabites? Why would he ask the Moabites to watch out for his mother and his father and his family? Can't trust anybody else, but there was a connection. Remember the book of Ruth? Ruth was a Moabite. Sister-in-law to Naomi, right? Ruth is the great-grandmother in Jesse's line. And so their family there. So they knew that they would be well received because they're coming back among family. And so that's the reason why he goes. But here's the thing. That also shows you the extent of Saul's rage against David, is that now he's not just content to take out David. He's looking for what? You know what? Enemies that we have, oftentimes if they can't harm us, who will they go after? Somebody close to you, family. Yeah. And that's the way Saul is operating. And so he takes his mother and father and them down to Moab. Verse number 5. Now the prophet Gad said to David, so we've got a new prophet that's introduced here. And so the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and he went into the forest of Hereth there in the land of Judah. Probably wasn't what David wanted to hear, but for God's purposes, he said, I want you down here, and so that's what he does. So we see David fleeing for refuge. He finds his refuge in the cave, but ultimately he finds his refuge in whom? In the Lord. Okay? He comes back in a good relationship. Then we come to verses 6 through 19, and this is the second part of what we'll look at tonight. And Saul murders the priest. Verse 6, when Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah, which that's where his palace was and so forth. He was under a tamask tree in Ramah with a spear in his hand and all of his servants standing about him. And then he said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is none who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. Now, you got to ask this question. Why do you think people haven't told him these things? Well, one, they're not true. That David's trying to undermine him. Okay, and yes, fear that he's got that spear in his hand. He's ready to pin somebody to the wall, right? But notice this. Notice the term he uses to describe David. He does not call him by name. What term does he use? Son of Jesse. Wonder why he would do that. So let's talk about what was Jesse. Who was Jesse, the father of David? He was a farmer. He was a shepherd, okay? So in other words, he was not in the upper echelon. He was of humble means. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to demean David's image, that he's nothing. Well, you know, if Saul would have looked in the mirror, if he remembered, he used to chase donkeys. Interesting how short our memory can be sometimes, right? But he's trying to basically demean David in the eyes of the people, all right? Because if he says David, what do they think of? The warrior, the great warrior. Killed the tens of thousands, okay? Yeah, the Goliath killer. So he calls him the son of Jesse. It's an intent to demean him. And so then he goes on and says this, and now listen to this. And there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Well, was any of that stuff true? No. But listen, nobody's sorry for me. Oh, doesn't that just break your heart? Oh, yeah, playing the victim, isn't he? Oh, my gracious, goodness gracious. Just, oh, goodness, it's sickening, all right? So basically, here's the thing. None of that stuff was true. Saul was self-deceived. He was deceived by his narcissism. He was deceived by his jealousy. He was deceived by his insecurity. Then you add the evil spirit on top of that. He's blind as a bat. Verse 9. Then answered Doeg the Edomite. Now, we saw this guy back in chapter 21. Remember? Where did we see him?
He gave bread to David.
Well, that was Ahimelech the priest, but Doeg was at the tabernacle, remember? And he saw David. And he saw David and Ahimelech interacting and so forth, all right? So, Doeg the Edomite. By the way, just get it out there, this guy's a slime ball. That's all there is to it. He's a slime. He reminds me of Judas or Haman. He's about that character, okay? And so it goes on and says, then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob. Let's stop right there. Now, notice the term that Doeg uses for David. What is it? He's never called him son of Jesse before this in his life. What do you think he's up to? Do what?
He's trying to get on Saul's good side.
Oh yeah, he's playing it up. Yeah, absolutely. That's the right word. All right. So it says. So he says, I saw the son of Jesse, in verse number 9, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Now, listen to what he says, and here's the question, what does his statement about Ahimelech, what does that do concerning Ahimelech in the eyes of Saul? Yeah, he's implicating Ahimelech as if he is an accomplice of David against Saul. That's the picture that he's intentionally painting. Verse 11, so the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king, and Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub, he answered, "Here am I, my Lord." Then Saul said, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and the sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day?" So in other words, basically what Doeg has done in our language, he has just taken the gun and he has just loaded the chamber and he's put it in Saul's hand. So let me kind of put it in perspective, sort of in, this is not quite as extreme as what's going to happen here in just a few moments, but let me kind of put it in from a perspective like myself as a pastor. Here's what Doeg has done. It's like, let's say somebody came to me. Let's say there's somebody here in the church and they and a family member, or maybe, God forbid, even another church member are at just great odds with each other. And one of those parties comes to me as their pastor to talk to me for counsel, and all I do is just pray with them, give them biblical counsel and wisdom about how God expects us to handle situations like this, and so forth. And then word gets out, and this other party finds out that I've met with these folks and talked with them and prayed with them. But these folks get all riled up because maybe it has been portrayed to them, or they make the assumption that I've chosen sides. Okay? Now, I'm talking out of real life experience. Okay? And then that just sets the world on fire. That's what Doeg did to somebody who was completely innocent and blameless, and there was no aligning or choosing of sides whatsoever. He was just doing what he does as a priest. But Doeg has loaded the gun and put it in Saul's hand. Okay? Verse 14. Let me back up and say something. That's the reason why we always need to be careful that if there's something going on and it's not any of our business, we need to keep our nose out of it. That's another reason why we don't need to have loose talk. That's the reason why we don't need to make assumptions based upon things we see or what we think we see. Satan's in all that stuff. And he's just waiting to blow a church up with it. Verse 14. So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David?" Now you got to give Ahimelech credit for one thing. He shows some courage here. I mean, he is speaking truth to power. Let me tell you something. When you speak truth to power, that's a dangerous place to be, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, and who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. I was just doing what a priest does, with no favor towards anybody." So he says, basically, Saul, there's no truth to what you're saying. So it takes a great deal of integrity and courage and boldness and the strength of conviction to stand there. Verse 16. And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because their hand also is with David." So now he's not only accusing Ahimelech, he's accusing every priest that's standing there, as is every single one of them. You see how the paranoia that this man is suffering from? "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord." Why? Why would they not strike them? Yeah. You do not touch the anointed of God, number one. Number two, they knew the allegations were not true.
For him to make that statement did not ring back to him.
Do what?
For Saul to make that statement did not ring back to him. Kill the priests of the Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, to make that statement and it not have some kind of impact.
Sure, because he's sitting on the throne as an anointed one, and he understands that, and he knew what he was doing. But here's the thing. You know, we can get ourselves to a place and spiritually messed up, mentally, emotionally, and we can just get in such our life in just a wad to where we can't even see the truth that we know is true. You're just blind. And that's where he was. He is blinded by his narcissism, his paranoia, his insecurity, and there again, and then you throw in the evil spirit that's at work here. I mean, he's just blind. He should have known that. So they refuse. His servants refused to kill the priest. Verse 18, and the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priest. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priest and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob. So that wasn't enough. So he goes to Nob, the city of the priests, and he struck with the edge of the sword both the men, women, children, nursing infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep with the edge of the sword. He wiped them all out, their families, their animals, everything. Here was something that dawned on me as I read that. Doeg was more effective at utterly destroying the priest and their houses and their belongings than what Saul was in going and utterly destroying the Amalekites and Agag, which is what got him in this fix to start with. Saul did not obey God and do what God said. Doeg, this slime ball, he just wipes them all out. I mean, that's just, you know, that's dark. That's one of the things, but you know what? Here's the thing. That's one of the things I love about Scripture. The Scriptures show warts and all. It just shows the warts and all of what goes on in life and the life of God's people and even the kings that ruled over his people and so forth. It's just, it's brutally honest. Daryl?
We think about bad things that happen today. You know, we hear about it so much because of the news.
Yeah. But it's been going on forever.
It's been going on since the beginning.
Yeah. It's always been going on.
I mean, this is really bad.
It's like, listen, it's like the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there is nothing new under the sun. It's just repackaged, might be better announced and promoted and all that kind of stuff, but there's nothing new under the sun. So then we come to the last few verses 20 through 23. Abiathar, the priest, flees to David. He's the sole survivor. Verse 20, now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, that named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priest. And so David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be saved. David was not guilty of that. That was not on David. I mean, obviously you could understand the remorse. Any of us probably would feel the remorse of that, but that's not on David. So one last thing, and I would say, I talked about how we saw last week some Psalms gave us some insights into David's experience in Gath, and we have some Psalms that give us insight into David's experience in Adullam, the cave. And interestingly enough, in Psalm 52, we find some insight about Doeg. In fact, in Psalm 52, the title says this, A Contemplation of David, when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. And David goes on and he writes some things. He says in the early part of that psalm, Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. In verse 5, he says, God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. You can read more about that in Psalm 52. All right, any questions? Don.
I'm asked a question, is why did God allow his priests to be killed?
That's like a lot of unanswered questions in life.
You know, and to tag into that too, if you look back at
Let me just say, for those listening online, the question is why did God allow his priests to be killed? And then we're talking about these unanswered questions in life. Ron, you were going to say?
Yeah, verse 21, verse 7, in my translation says, one of Saul's servants detained before the Lord was there that day. His name was Billy. God knows everything, but why he was detained there, why was he detained there instead of before the Lord? Did you get no way to chance to the right there? God chose not to do that?
Who knows? Listen, I'll tell you, and I'm dealing with someone now who's struggling with that why question. And it's human nature, to wonder those things. Only in the sovereignty of God, well, is that understood? We just don't have answers for it, Daryl.
Well, Steve, something that reading through all this is really, I guess, stands out to me as being really unusual, and that's that after he was, basically, God identified him as his king of Israel. Well, he's been living on the run ever since, hasn't he? David has.
Yeah.
Hiding, trying to keep away from Saul.
Yeah, especially once David began to be known and he began to be looked upon as such an effective warrior and so forth. And there again, a lot of it goes back to that whole thing about people singing, Saul 1,000, David 10,000. That's where the green-eyed monster of jealousy sets in. But pretty much since that time, Saul's had his eye on him and tried to pin him to the wall a few times, and now he's just on the hunt to kill him. Anybody else? All right, thank you all so much for joining us online. Have a blessed evening. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to